everyone, and thanks for clicking on to this video. I have not made a video in quite a while. Think I've transitioned to just creating content in the summer when I'm off, when the school year has wrapped up, but I've also been delaying, or I haven't made content, even though the school year has been over for a couple of weeks now for me, only because I've been a bit distracted with distance learning, and then in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, I have been distracted, and rightfully so. But I think I'm in a place now where I can start to create content, and I thought I'd start here. And here is just sharing a few titles. They're just 4 books that I think I can recommend to maybe doing a little bit more investigation into what's happening and understanding how we got to this place. So I'm recommending these books for 2 reasons. One, these titles, these works can help people who are not black to understand what it's like to be black in America and in other countries around the world where there has been a history of systemic racism, and get a little piece of their story, because I think understanding people's stories can help with creating empathy needed to be able to fight on the behalf of someone who is not like yourself and who has had different experiences from yourself. So that's one reason. The other reason is I'm recommending these books for those who want to try to understand how history has played a part in what we're experiencing today. So basically understanding the causes and roots and how ideas have lingered through time to create systemic racism, which is a word that you're probably hearing a lot in the news. How has that been created? So these books kind of delve into them as well. These are all books that I've read. I'm actually currently reading Stamped by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that in another video, but I didn't want to recommend it here because I haven't finished the text. I'm also reading We Can Do More Than Survive by Bettina Love, which is focused on education and abolitionist style of education. And again, I want to talk about that, but I haven't finished that book yet. So when I do finish, or as I'm reading, I'm not sure how I want to do that, I will talk about those books later, which is why they're not included here, but you'll hopefully see them in another video. So let's get started. I'm going to start with this book here, Acala, and yes, he just goes by one name, Acala. It's a pretty famous rapper in the UK. I don't live there, so I'm not sure how his work has been received, but from what I gather, he has become a voice of I guess talking about racial injustice in Britain. Because of his writing, I learned about the Windrush scandal. I've learned about what it's like to be black Caribbean in Britain, and what it's like to be a black Briton, and I just think the black diaspora is beautiful, but we've all had challenges in the various locations that our ancestors were brought to, and so in this book he takes the lens of British history, and he talks about how race and class play into a lot of the institutions, and how it played its way into political engagement in our history. And again, it's mainly coming from the viewpoint of British history, right? But I think what this book does really well is it looks at the intersectionality of class and race, and so how does economy play a factor or play a role in race? And you'll see how it's in some ways it's very different in the United Kingdom than it is here in the United States. I'll just mention 2 things about the book that I found most interesting along these lines. So one way in which race and class play into, I guess, the British ideas of race and discrimination is the ongoing conflict with Ireland, so that the black immigrants from the Caribbean and the Irish tend to have had a much more congeniality. They were comrades in the struggle and in the fight, whereas in the United States that is not the case. Not to say that the Irish were always treated well, but they have kind of been subsumed into the idea of whiteness over time. And so that connection between the Irish and Black British, which Acala talks about in this book, is not the same here. And so, again, just expertly talking about intersectionality and how these nuanced ways of looking at race can look different in different places. I thought that was brilliant. The other thing that I really liked about this book was the way he delved into the history of Cuba and South Africa, and how Britain and other world factors, but mainly Britain under the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, rewrote the history, or I wouldn't say rewrote, but skewed the history of Cuba, and so that it is what it is today. Especially in the United States, there is a long history of having a very fraught and volatile relationship with Cuba, and he kind of goes into why that is and how that came to be. And it's not just communism. So I would totally recommend this. I wouldn't say that this is a good book for young people. It's not written for young people, but it is a well-crafted book, easily accessible. It's almost like a conversation that he's having with you. He is well, I wouldn't say trained, but he's well versed in giving lectures. I think he has been awarded degrees from like Oxford and Cambridge, so he can be quite erudite at times, but he's done plenty of TED Talks. He's done a lot of school work and school engagement, so he does do a lot of work in the lecture format, and so I do feel like this is a little bit, tone-wise at least, a little bit inaccessible for younger people. But I think as an adult, anyone, 11th grade or older, can read this and gain the information that he's trying to share. I'm going to move on to the next book. This is not a history book. This is a memoir written by Roxane Gay, Bad Feminist. I read this during the period of quarantine that we're still in, and I love this. There were so many moments in this book where I was just like, oh, me too. And she so clearly talks about how being Black and being female puts her in a very unique place in America. And for that, it's just, for me at least, to have the words, the language to share what my experience is like and has been is so important, because a lot of times we know what we feel, we know what we experience, but sometimes it's hard to put it in words and to express. And so that's one of the things I really enjoy about reading, is to gain the language of other people to better express my own thoughts and my own views and my own experiences. And the more stories we get, the better we can become at expressing just all of the many facets of who we are, and the facets of the community that we live in, right? But anyway, I'm going on a tangent. This book, again, is not a history book. It's a memoir. She chronicles stories from her childhood, teenage years, even as a PhD candidate, and what it was like to be a young academic, and then also adult life and being in the public eye more. So I think this would be a great book for women. Like I said, it was great for me to be able to gain the wisdom of her experience to better express my own experience. I feel like I gained, as a Black woman, better understanding of how to understand my own intersectionality as a Black female after reading this book. But I think this could also be useful, especially for white women, to read, to understand how it is different, even though we share the same gender. But being a Black woman and being a white woman can have vastly different experiences, and I think that this could be a very useful book to better understand what that's like. The third book, the third of the four that I want to share, is this one. It's probably the most famous book of the four books that I want to talk about. Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. He talks about what it's like to have grown up in apartheid South Africa. Although apartheid ended while he was still a child, just coming out of the effects of that what it was like to have been born into and be a young child in such a stringent, strong area of segregation. And it's, I think it's amazing. His mother is the reason to read the story. She is so powerful, and the way he writes about her, you can just tell that he loves and adores his mom. But yeah, Patricia, his mother, is probably the most interesting character in this memoir. I enjoy the way that he not only talks about the absurdity of race in this book. You just, as you're reading it, you see how crazy it is and how absurd it is, but yet you can also see how one might be duped by the allure of racism, right? And he talks about what I think is the most important part of this book, or the thing that touched me the most, is the fluidity of whiteness, which is an idea I'd not quite had firmly thought out or grappled with, but he mentions how the idea of whiteness has changed, and it incorporates and it displaces people to fit its needs. And so I'm not going to spoil any part of the book, but he does link the fluidity of whiteness to economics, and how that plays a huge part in who the culture deems white, and then who the culture rejects as black or colored. It's a very funny book. It's conversational in tone. It's, I would think, similar to, not I think, I know, but in my opinion, I think it's similar to the style of The Daily Show. I did read this with my students. This was the last book that I gave my students before we had to move to distance learning. And while we were listening to the book, we had the physical copy as well. And I really enjoy the audio because he does incorporate elements of the Tosa language and other languages that are spoken in South Africa. And so while myself and none of my students speak those languages, I was so grateful for the audio because it allowed us to actually hear it and experience it and not just gloss over it, which would have been more likely the case if we just stuck with the text version. But because we were doing them both, I think it added a little bit of more richness to it. Plus, his delivery is awesome. Being a comedian, there were several times when my students laughed out loud in class, and like that's that was so great when I saw my students engaging in the story in that way, that they were following along, that they were picking up the jokes and enjoying the read. So I would recommend this for young people. I think this is a great book for young people to read with an adult, to start a conversation about races and racism in not just America but around the world, and what that might look like, because it's a diasporic issue. It's not just, like I mentioned before, an issue in the United States. But I would recommend this, like I said, for young people as well as adults. This, I think, could span both age groups. And the last book is one that is written particularly for young people, although it's, I mean, adults can definitely read it as well. But I think the authors are focusing to get this information to middle schoolers. The name of the book is Stamped, and I mentioned the parent book of it, I guess, earlier when I said I was reading Stamped by Ibram X. Kendi. This is the book that, the same book, essentially, but remixed for a younger audience, and it was rewritten by Jason Reynolds, who is a well-known YA author, and it has his humor and kind of irreverent tone to it, which is great because after listening to a couple of interviews of his, he said he did not want this to be seen as a history book. He didn't want it to read like a history book, and so he took on this very conversational and irreverent tone that young people are, I guess, more inclined to listen to. It does break the history up chronologically, so that I think it's easy to like start and stop. You can just read about a certain or particular time period, put the book down, have a discussion, and then start at a different time period, so that you can understand how these racist ideas have strung along through time historically. Also, what is great about this book is in the back, the authors have given not just extensive notes, which is great for research, so using it, so young people can definitely use this as a research tool, but there's extended reading. So Jason Reynolds and Amber Max Kendi have provided like next books. So where to go next is just amazing. So this book basically is education in and of itself. Start here, and then you can use the guides in the back of the book to move yourself forward to understanding and learning more about racist ideas and race and issues of injustice that we are currently in our time period trying to combat. And I hope that this thing lasts. I hope that there's real change that comes out of it. I am so hopeful. I'm saying it out loud, which sounds weird because this has happened over and over and over again, and it's just, I'm hoping that this time is different. I'm hoping that this time we see real change, and that my young nephews won't have to do all the work that I've had to do, that my parents had to do, that my grandparents have had to do, that there be a shift for the better. I'm running out of words because I'm starting to get emotional, but I just want to say this is not the end-all and be-all of texts that you should be reading. And so if you have other ideas, other suggestions of what people could read, other resources, please leave those down below. The more information people get, the better. I'm an educator, I'm biased about that, but I think education is the key to creating long-lasting change. So yes, leave anything that you would suggest and recommend down below. If you have read any of these books, then let's start a conversation. If you have concerns or anything in these books sparked something in you that you want to talk about, I would love to engage in a conversation with you about these books. So look out for some more videos because I feel ready to create and I feel inspired to engage in the YouTube community. And yeah, bye.